General Hospital spoilers reveal that Diane had always believed. She understood the limits of her profession, the invisible lines a lawyer should never cross, the ethical walls that kept justice intact even when the world around her fractured. But the situation she now faced with Michael was unlike anything she had handled before, because for the first time in many years, the survival of her client was positioned directly opposite the safety, dignity, and professional life of her closest friend. This shift, so subtle at first, began as a simple legal adjustment, a recalibration of priorities as the prosecution turned its focus toward Michael, after failing to build a case against Willow. Yet the further Diane traveled down this path, the clearer it became that protecting Michael meant walking deeper into a storm that could destroy Alexis in ways neither of them were prepared to withstand. Michael was not just another client. He was someone whose family had repeatedly relied on Diane's expertise, whose life had been tangled in legal battlegrounds that demanded her sharpest instincts. But now, the stakes had evolved into something far more volatile, because the only route left to save him was to expose the very truth Alexis had been working endlessly to keep buried. Diane knew Willow had fired the gun. She knew the fragments of evidence that pointed in Willow's direction were stronger than Alexis wanted to admit. She knew that revisiting these pieces, reframing them, and illuminating them under new legal scrutiny would instantly shift culpability away from Michael. Yet she also understood something far more devastating. Alexis had already stepped deeply into defensive territory for Willow, had shaped her legal stance based on the belief that shielding her was the lesser evil, and had placed herself perhaps unknowingly on the razor's edge of ethical danger. If Diane pursued this approach, Alexis could lose everything: her license, her reputation, and most catastrophically, her custody rights over Scout, a child who had become the emotional anchor that steadied her after years of personal turmoil. Diane had been there through all of it, through Alexis' sleepless nights when she feared she would never return to the courtroom again, through the slow rebuilding of her confidence, through the fragile foundations of a professional comeback that Alexis tended like a delicate flame. That history now weighed against Diane like a moral chain, tugging one direction while her responsibilities as Michael's attorney pulled her violently in another. The danger grew sharper each day as prosecutor Justine Turner intensified her pressure. Turner was relentless, methodical, ruthless in her pursuit of a conviction. And the moment she realized Willow was not an easy target, she pivoted toward Michael without hesitation. Turner understood the optics, the family dynamics, and the public fascination with the Corinthos name. She knew a conviction against Michael carried the drama and gravity that courts and society paid attention to. Diane could see the strategy forming. If Turner could not imprison Willow, she would make Michael the embodiment of culpability. And once that happened, the narrative would cling to him like blood on linen, impossible to wash clean. This was why Diane forced herself to accept the necessity of intervention, even if it meant pulling apart the fragile piece Alexis had built. But each step forward required her to confront a growing sense of betrayal, because she knew Alexis had made decisions in good faith, even if they were legally precarious. Alexis had believed she was doing the right thing by minimizing certain evidence, by framing Willow in a gentler, more sympathetic light, by constructing a defensive posture that protected a young woman she saw as traumatized, rather than malicious. In protecting Willow, Alexis had exposed herself, and Diane knew Turner would not hesitate to tear into that vulnerability if it suited her case against Michael. The tension simmering between Diane and Alexis was almost unbearable, a silent strain woven through every shared moment in the office. Diane's composure, once warm and confident, had become colder, more restrained. She found herself avoiding eye contact, not from guilt, but from the fear that Alexis would see the truth in her eyes too soon. Alexis sensed every change, every shift in tone, and though nothing had been spoken aloud, she understood that Diane was making moves she did not want to reveal. Alexis had spent her life reading people, interpreting intentions, surviving betrayals large and small. The quietness in Diane's demeanor felt like the calm before an avalanche, and yet Alexis could not bring herself to confront the situation directly. She did not want to hear, from Diane's own mouth, that their legal interests were now misaligned, or worse, that Diane was preparing to use information that could destroy her. The worst part was the growing fear that Alexis might lose Scout. The legal system was merciless toward attorneys accused of concealing or manipulating evidence, and Turner would not hesitate to weaponize any misstep. Alexis' entire world was constructed around that small child, the love she felt, the certainty that Scout represented her second chance at motherhood and stability. Losing custody would not simply break Alexis, it would shatter her beyond recognition. Diane knew this, and the guilt pressed on her like a crushing weight. Yet she also knew the prosecution would destroy Michael without an aggressive counterattack. Someone would have to fall to save him, and Turner would gladly ensure that the person falling was Alexis. Diane's nights became restless, filled with fragmented thoughts and imagined consequences. She saw Michael's life collapsing. She saw Alexis stripped of her license, standing hollow-eyed before a disciplinary board. She saw Scout taken from her, placed in another home, another family. A future Alexis would never forgive herself for losing. The duality of these outcomes haunted Diane, because in a just world, protecting one friend would not mean sacrificing another. But the world they lived in was not just, it was strategic, manipulative, and unforgiving. And Diane had long ago accepted that justice was often a negotiation rather than a principle. Meanwhile, Turner continued to gather momentum. Every document she requested, every subpoena she prepared, every whisper she sent through the courthouse corridors, threatened to expose the cracks in Alexis' handling of Willow's case. Diane saw it all unfolding with terrifying clarity. Turner was circling Alexis like a predator who had found the weakest point in the herd. The question was no longer whether Alexis would come under attack, but when. If Diane did nothing, Michael would fall. If Diane acted, Alexis might lose every part of the life she had rebuilt. The cruel balance of this dilemma became the defining torment of Diane's days. Alexis, too, felt the storm approaching. Her intuition, sharpened by years of personal battles, told her that Diane's silence was not neutrality, but preparation. She began to imagine the worst-case scenarios, Turner accusing her of withholding evidence, the Bar Association demanding a review, court after court examining her actions with cold detachment. She imagined her opponents questioning her fitness as a guardian, using her past vulnerabilities against her, twisting every mistake she had ever made into proof that she was unfit to raise Scout. The possibility clawed at her with a savagery she had not felt in years. Yet she could not bring herself to blame Diane, not fully, because she also understood that Diane was bound to Michael, just as she herself was bound to Willow. The tragedy of the situation was that both women were acting from loyalty, from love, from deeply rooted convictions that had shaped their identities. Diane wanted to save Michael. Alexis wanted to protect Willow. Both wanted to preserve justice in the way they believed justice should function. And yet, the structure of the case itself forced them into opposite corners, turning their bond into a liability that could unravel everything. As the case edged closer to a turning point, Diane realized she was nearing the moment when she could no longer avoid making a definitive move. Either she would bring her evidence forward to dismantle the prosecution's case against Michael, or she would allow Turner to build a damning argument that could send him to prison. Both paths held catastrophic consequences. Both paths required her to sacrifice something essential. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was which choice would cost more. And as the pressure mounted, the only certainty that remained was this: one decision from Diane could save a life, destroy a career, uproot a child, or sever a friendship forever. In a world where justice was rarely fair, the consequences of her next step would echo far beyond the courtroom, reshaping every future connected to Michael, Willow, Alexis, and Scout. The danger had never been greater, and the price had never been higher. There was a time when the bond between Alexis and Diane felt unbreakable, a partnership built on sharpened intellect, shared victories, and a rare kind of emotional loyalty that only two women who had survived too many storms could truly understand. Yet the deeper the case surrounding Willow, Michael, and the gunshot that changed everything became, the clearer it was that something inside that bond had begun to fracture. It didn't shatter all at once. Instead, it cracked slowly, the way ice begins to split under quiet pressure long before the sound becomes audible. Diane felt the shift first, the subtle, almost imperceptible change in how she carried herself around Alexis. as though some invisible weight had settled on her shoulders, making every gesture careful, every breath measured. This was the beginning of the adjustment, the new reality forming around her whether she welcomed it or not. Diane had always prided herself on being able to protect those who needed her most. It was the foundation of her career, the anchor of her moral compass. But now the impossible had risen before her. She had to people she cared for, to people whose futures depended on her. Yet their paths were colliding in ways that the law would not allow to be reconciled. She wanted to save Michael from the tightening grip of the prosecution. She also wanted to protect Alexis from the consequences of her earlier choices. Choices made from compassion but rooted in risk. And yet, the more Diane tried to shield both of them, the more she realized she was stepping into a labyrinth where every turn demanded a sacrifice. This was the real adjustment, the kind that rewires not only strategy, but identity. Diane was being forced to become someone she had never imagined, a woman willing to expose the truth, even when that truth could wound the people she loved most. Each day, the weight of the upcoming revelation grew heavier, and the distance between her and Alexis widened, not because of anger, but because of fear. Diane feared what would happen once she finally stepped into the spotlight with her findings. She feared that the person she would hurt the most would not be Michael, nor the prosecution, but Alexis, her friend, her ally, the one woman she had trusted to stand beside her no matter what storm approached. Alexis, in turn, sensed the unraveling long before Diane admitted it to herself. She felt the tension between them vibrating like a taut string about to snap. The way Diane avoided certain topics, the way her expression tightened when Michael's name emerged, the way her silence spoke louder than any confession could, these were signs Alexis understood. All too well, she had lived a lifetime recognizing the quiet cues of betrayal, disappointment, and looming catastrophe. Though she did not want to believe Diane could be the one to deliver such a blow, her instincts warned her that something monumental was shifting beneath her feet. The emotional fracture became more pronounced as the investigation deepened. Diane's attempts to protect both sides began to fail, because protecting one required exposing the vulnerability of the other. The legal system had no patience for emotional nuance. It demanded clarity, blame, evidence, and Diane was now tasked with presenting exactly that. In her relentless push to save Michael from becoming the prosecution's next prize, she began to uncover inconsistencies in the timeline, threads of truth Alexis had quietly tucked away, and pieces of evidence that pointed back to Willow's involvement in the shooting. These discoveries did not shock Diane, they confirmed what she already suspected, but they became the catalyst for the new phase of her internal struggle. The real adjustment came when she realized she could no longer keep these findings hidden, not without risking the destruction of her own integrity. For Diane, the law was not simply a career, it was the very architecture of her identity, and she could not survive knowing she had allowed a man to be prosecuted when the truth was within her reach. The conflict tore at her. If she exposed everything, she would save Michael but potentially ruin Alexis' reputation, possibly costing her custody of Scout and jeopardizing the license she had fought so hard to reclaim. Yet if she stayed silent, she would betray her duty, her principles, and the very essence of the lawyer she believed herself to be. This realization carved the deepest rift yet between them. Alexis saw Diane withdrawing emotionally, but she did not know the full extent of the truth Diane was hiding. The weight of this knowledge made Diane appear colder, more distant, as though she were bracing herself for the moment when she would inevitably become the source of Alexis' heartbreak. Diane tried to balance the scales, to find a path that would safeguard both their futures. But every solution crumbled under the uncompromising demands of the case. The prosecution was circling, the public was watching, and time was running out. So Diane made a choice, the kind of choice that reshapes the course of relationships forever. She decided to expose everything. She decided to bring the buried truth into the open, not because she wanted to hurt Alexis, but because she could not allow the wrong person to be sacrificed in the name of loyalty. This decision marked the final adjustment, the one that transformed her from a protector into a force of disruption. She understood that her revelation would not only alter the trajectory of the investigation, but would also unleash an emotional shockwave strong enough to push Alexis and her into opposing corners. It was a necessary cruelty, one she accepted even as she felt it tearing through the foundation of their friendship. When Diane began preparing her findings, the entire atmosphere around her shifted. There was a sense of inevitability in her actions, a quiet acceptance that the woman she loved as a sister would soon feel betrayed. The truth she was about to reveal was not merely legal, it was personal, emotional, and deeply intertwined with the private fears Alexis kept hidden from the world. By lifting the veil, Diane was forcing Alexis to face consequences she had never imagined. Consequences that could dismantle her stability, threaten her custody of Scout, and devastate her already fragile sense of safety. Yet Diane pressed forward because she believed that truth, even painful truth, was the only way to prevent even greater destruction. This belief did not make her feel stronger. It made her feel haunted. The knowledge that she was trading her friendship with Alexis for the sake of Michael's freedom was a torment she carried with heavy resignation. The closer she came to the moment of revelation, the more she felt herself splitting apart, part of her driven by justice, the other clinging desperately to the memory of the bond she shared with Alexis. And when the moment finally arrived, when Diane stepped forward to expose the truth and unveil the evidence she had gathered, everything changed. The ripple effect was immediate, crashing through the fragile equilibrium Alexis had tried to maintain. The revelation shattered illusions, pushed loyalties to the breaking point, and exposed every hidden flaw in the foundation of their relationship. Alexis realized instantly what Diane had done, and in that realization, the emotional distance between them hardened into something colder, sharper, and irreversible. Diane had not chosen malice, but the result felt the same. The fracture became a fault line threatening to swallow everything they had built together. This was the new reality, the adjustment born from necessity, the transformation born from sacrifice. Diane had let TMGI Chu Yun, and in doing so, she had unleashed a wild, uncontrollable change neither of them could escape. The legal world would shift, the emotional world would tremble, and the bond between Diane and Alexis, once unshakable, now stood on the edge of collapse. Forever altered by the truth Diane could no longer hide. There was a moment, so brief it was almost unnoticeable, when everything shifted for Diane, an internal adjustment, a recalibration of instinct and responsibility that she had not anticipated but could no longer deny. It was the kind of change that begins as a whisper in the back of the mind, a quiet recognition that the situation had evolved beyond simple legal maneuvering and into something far more volatile. This adjustment became the axis on which her entire strategy revolved, and as it grew stronger, it sent wave after wave of consequences spiraling outward, touching not only Michael and Alexis, but now sweeping Willow and Drew into a vortex of danger they could never have imagined. The more Diane attempted to protect everyone she believed deserved a second chance, the more tangled the web became, until every effort she made, whether driven by loyalty or law, began to look like the starting point of a catastrophe she could not control. What Diane did not foresee was how deeply her new approach would drag Willow and Drew into peril. They had already been standing too close to the flames, but this adjustment fanned them into a wildfire that threatened to consume everything they had fought to hold together. Willow, fragile beneath her calm exterior, found herself becoming the center of a narrative she could no longer escape. The truth she had tried so desperately to bury was beginning to surface again, summoned not by malice, but by Diane's relentless pursuit of a defense, powerful enough to protect Michael. Yet the chain reaction of that pursuit placed Willow under a scrutiny sharper than anything she had endured before. The prosecution, eager for victory, began re-examining motives, mechanical details, timing, emotional volatility. Every fragment of her life was now evidence waiting to be twisted. And through it all, Willow could feel the walls closing in, feel the pressure building, feel the dangerous weight of a truth she could not outrun. Drew, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a parallel nightmare. He had tried to be the steady one, the anchor in a chaos he could not fully understand. But now he was being pulled into the same danger as Willow, not because of anything he had done, but because Diane's shifting approach created a new landscape where the lines between guilt, protection, and responsibility were blurring at a frightening pace. The image of him as the victim, the injured man, the one who deserved sympathy, began to erode with every new theory raised by the prosecution. The more Diane pushed to redirect attention, the more Turner and her team countered by suggesting Drew might be hiding something, that perhaps he knew more than he had admitted, that perhaps the story presented was not as straightforward as it seemed. The idea that he might lose not only his credibility, but also the fragile emotional stability he had fought so hard to build seemed increasingly unavoidable. It became clear that this adjustment Diane had made this new strategy born from desperation, and duty was creating a new obsession inside her, the obsession to fix everything at once. She believed, with unwavering conviction, that she could prevent all three worlds from collapsing, that if she just worked harder, thought smarter, moved faster, she could keep Michael out of prison, protect Alexis from professional ruin, and somehow also shield Willow and Drew from the fallout they were now facing. But obsession is a dangerous companion in law, and this one began to twist her thinking in ways she could not fully see. The more she chased the illusion of total protection, the more dangerous the situation became for everyone involved. Willow's name was whispered in the hallways of the courthouse with suspicion. Drew's injuries were re-examined not as a tragedy, but as a tool, and every attempt Diane made to reroute the narrative simply created more openings for Turner to attack. Willow and Drew now stood on the edge of losing everything, not because of one choice, but because of the growing network of choices made around them. Their safety, their reputations, their relationship, even their sense of reality began to tremble under the weight of the legal chaos, pulling them deeper into danger. Willow feared the collapse of her family, the unraveling of the stability she had tried so desperately to preserve. Drew feared that the people he trusted would abandon him, that the truth would swallow him whole, that he would be left fighting for survival in a world where every piece of evidence seemed to contradict the last. The danger that once hovered at a distance now wrapped itself around them like a tightening rope, squeezing until breathing felt like a luxury. And behind all of it, Alexis was paying a price she never imagined she would face again. Diane's adjustment, though necessary in the legal sense, placed Alexis directly in the line of fire. The choices she had made earlier rooted in empathy, in moral instinct, in the desire to protect Willow from further harm were now being dissected under a merciless spotlight. Turner was not merely questioning the legitimacy of the evidence. She was questioning Alexis herself, her judgment, her ethics, her fitness to stand before a judge. And beneath that professional scrutiny lurked an even more terrifying threat. The possibility that Alexis' custody of Scout could be challenged. If she was found to have compromised her legal obligations, the thought of losing Scout, of losing the one bright, innocent light that had kept her grounded, haunted her every waking moment. This was the new danger, the one Diane had unintentionally set in motion. Alexis found herself standing alone in a battlefield. She thought she had already survived once in her life. Each whisper of misconduct tightened the noose. Each legal twist reminded her of how fragile her restored career truly was. And with every step Diane took toward revealing the truth needed to save Michael, Alexis saw another piece of her own world sliding toward destruction. She wanted to trust Diane. She wanted to believe her friend would find a way to save them both. But the deeper Diane reached into the truth, the more Alexis realized she was becoming the collateral damage of a war that was never meant for her. The adjustment Diane had embraced now exposed everyone. Willow and Drew stood to lose their peace, their reputations, and the life they had built. Alexis stood to lose her career, her freedom, and the child she loved. And Diane, caught in the center, felt the crushing weight of responsibility threatening to break her. She was holding too many pieces at once, balancing too many lives on the edge of a blade, and her every move seemed to slice deeper into the people she most hoped to protect. This was no longer a legal battle. It was a slow, spreading collapse, a chain reaction of danger ignited by truth, fueled by desperation, and accelerated by the very adjustments Diane had believed would save everyone. Now, the only question left was not who would fall, but who would fall first.